so many of the young people are in the gig economy, but they're only in the gig economy to kind of get by. They're not trying to create the wealth that in my generation we went to work in corporate America to create.
Anybody else have work up in the air and curious about what the future holds, maybe even looking to reinvent themselves? And join in. Let's do this. Well, welcome back into Reinvention, my friends. And I want to start today's episode with a question. If your son or daughter graduated from high school tomorrow, what advice would you give them, right? Because for decades, the answer seemed obvious. Go to college, get a degree, find a stable career, and everything else will fall into place. But we are living in one of the biggest transformations in the history of work. AI is reshaping jobs almost daily. Skills are becoming more valuable than credentials in many industries, and employers are beginning to rethink degree requirements. And for the first time in generations, many parents are asking a question that would have seemed almost unthinkable just a few years ago. Is a 4-year college degree still the best path? Now, this isn't an argument against higher education. It's a conversation about possibility, because maybe the future isn't college or no college. Maybe it's about finding the right path for each individual, one that's more flexible, more affordable, and more connected to the way that work is actually changing. So if you're a parent trying to prepare your kids for a world that looks very different from the one that you've entered, or if you're wondering what skills will actually matter over the next decade, then you're going to want to listen closely to this conversation. Okay, so today's guest is Kathleen deLaski, and she's a social entrepreneur, a philanthropist, a teacher, also a futurist, and the author of the book, Who Needs College Anymore? For years, she's been studying how education, technology, and work are evolving together. And her research explores how colleges are adapting, why employers are placing greater emphasis on skills, and what families should be thinking about as they help young people navigate the future. All right, so whether you have teenagers at home or you're simply curious about where education is headed, I think you're going to come away from this conversation with a fresh perspective. So excited to dive in. Kathleen, welcome into Reinvention. Glad you're here.
Well, what a great setup, Todd. I want to hear this conversation. Thank you.
I want to start off by asking a question that almost every parent is asking, okay? If you're out there and you have a 16-year-old at home, are we assuming that college is still the default path, or do we need to open ourselves up to different possibilities?
Well, I think it really depends on several things: your family circumstances, the nature of your child, and their academic identity. Do they see themselves as sitting in a desk for 4 more years right away or maybe later? Do they have a particular interest that is always probably going to require a college degree? For example, being a doctor or even being a lawyer. Yeah, so certain jobs, they might as well get in the gauntlet because it will take them 6 or 8 years to get to prepare for their career. And that's probably not changing anytime soon. But if they are interested in business, in certain parts of healthcare, that are not like having doctor before their name, or they don't know what they're interested in and they just want to explore, I think that for the first time in 50 years, it's a very fair question to ask. Maybe you dip your toe in an inexpensive and low stakes way, try community college or go to the state university and test it out. So almost kind of prototyping a couple of different career exploration tracks. That's what I see a lot of families doing. And then, of course, the other thing we see more doing, you can see this from the statistics, is students, particularly males, are saying, well, I actually would rather work with my hands anyway. I see that electricians are in high demand, and I would rather go to a trade school. It's prepackaged. I don't have to think about it. I get paid right away, and it is going to be a steady career. That's sort of the series of questions I would take somebody through. And I didn't mention, do you have the funds to pay for it? My view is if you are from a low-income family, you definitely can find ways to help get it paid for it through Pell Grants or scholarships. But you might have to lower your sights on what school you want to go to. It's really the middle-class families that have to do this other calculus, because wealthy families, mom and dad say, we got it, honey. Go have this wonderful coming-of-age experience. And very low-income students are paid for by the government, really. It's everybody in the middle that now has this new calculus.
A lot to unpack there. I want to start off with the first thing that you shared, which was this notion of looking at going to college as an experimentation and testing it out to see if this is the right match. Like you just kind of casually said, oh yeah, well, maybe I'll check out community college, and I'll see if that works for me. I mean, at least where I come from, I've lived in big cities. I've lived in New York. I lived in San Francisco. I've lived in LA where I am now. And the people that I've been around and most of the people that I work with come from the lineage of, wow, we got to get our kids into the best possible school. We're going to invest in that if we have the funds. We're going to, try to get the higher education because those are the people that end up winning this crazy game that we've been in for a long time and getting the best jobs in their careers. But there really does feel like an undercurrent of shift right now that's happening, right? And I think you're tapping into it a little bit. Am I saying this correctly? What are your thoughts come up when I talk about it from that perspective?
Absolutely. The idea of the 4-year degree is still, it's a luxury good, but it's becoming more of a luxury good. So I think that the number of families that will react the way you describe, which is that, the game is getting your kid into the best college possible so that they don't have to have their own social capital. The brand will carry them into a great job. For a certain number of colleges, that is still the case. And so you'll always see that sweepstakes going on and that, sort of killer pressure cooker situation in communities where that, the best college you can get into is prized. And you can talk about it at dinner parties. My kid got into Stanford and Dartmouth and can't decide which one to go to. But the cutoff point for that milieu, if you will, or the people who are in that situation, is getting more and more elevated. It's higher in the sense that maybe today, 38% of American adults are getting a 4-year degree. My prediction in the book is that by mid-century, so 15 years, that number will shrink to probably 20% or 25%. And it will probably hover there. That's not to say that the rest of the students that are not in that category anymore wouldn't be going to college. They just wouldn't necessarily be pursuing a 4-year degree. And you already see the enrollment trends headed in that direction, right? The fastest growing form of college is certificates and shorter term degrees. So what I advocate in my book is let's shift to a mental model where college for most people who who aren't seeking these particular type of highly professional jobs that require, a license, which requires a degree, like doctor, lawyer, et cetera, that for the rest of us, we should kind of think of college as sort of a step ladder. You can earn credentials that are much shorter term than 4 years or 6 years, as the average student is actually spending longer than 4 years in school, often because they have to work. Let's look at a mental model where you're maybe coming in for 6 months, you're getting a certificate with a credential, you're able to go to work, you're testing out that career, you're coming back in, or you're going to school alongside that job and you're moving up your career ladder with doses of, we call them micro pathways, doses of learning, stacks of learning in between your early career experiences.
You mentioned before we got on and started the interview that your book came out in the beginning of 2025 and it did well. And then there was a huge spike in May when the public consciousness got hit with AI and all of a sudden your topic really became in vogue and people are really concerned about the future of work. It's, the premise of this podcast. Like, I'm trying to figure out like where we're headed, right? So you have a very interesting perspective here for the younger people and for the parents that are concerned and worried. I have a question. You're talking about doctors and lawyers, like, oh, if you just need that degree, then yes, the 4-year college. But I'm questioning that. I mean, especially lawyers. Is there a legal profession? I mean, I'm talking to people that are telling me no. I had Bill Burnett on the show who runs the Stanford School of Design, and he wrote Designing Your Life, a big best-selling New York Times book.
Right.
And he's like, I'm ringing the bell at Stanford at the PhD program saying, get out. Like, there's no careers here in 5 years from now. So are you changing your tune on that? Like, I'm not saying the whole system is going to blow up here, but I think we have to be realistic. That lawyers, like, is that really going to be a thing that requires a 4-year degree and then passing the bar and all that? Like, what is your research showing on that part?
Yeah.
If you've been looking at it recently?
Interesting. There is one state where you don't need either an undergraduate degree or a law degree to practice law. And I use it as a trivia question. And recently everyone's getting, they know the answer because Kim Kardashian is somebody who did this. And so it's California. They haven't ever removed the law from the books that allows you to read the law and apprentice, which is how it used to be. You used to need a degree back in the day to read law. And so if you apprentice in California, you can technically become a lawyer. But, law school is kind of an outlier because, law school applications were up 25% this year. And so there's no incentive for law schools to change the rules. This is where you see licensed fields beginning to drop their degree requirements, or not necessarily drop them, but bend over backwards to help you get that degree more easily. You see it in nursing and you see it in teaching. And I think soon you're going to see it in like dentistry. You're going to see it in accounting. These are fields that require at least a master's degree often, not nursing, but in some of these other ones, they require to be licensed in the state in that job role. You have to have these higher degrees. And I think those requirements will start to be dropped and they'll take experience in lieu of years of study. They'll do whatever they can when there are talent shortages. There's a new type of degree that's coming online now called the apprentice degree. And that is being used specifically in teaching and nursing because of the shortages in those fields.
What is the apprentice degree like?
Okay, so the apprentice degree, I feature an example in my book in teaching where people who are in the building, in the school building and not teachers, like maybe they're an aide, a teacher's aide, or they're the custodian, and they're interested in teaching, they are being basically put into programs to upskill them and get their GED if they need that, and then their degree while they're on the job, and they're being paid on the job because they need jobs, and they're getting their degree. So that's been really interesting. And I think you'll see that if we have doctor shortages, you'll see that. If we have lawyer shortages, you'll see that. It will totally depend on whether we have shortages.
Interesting. So the shortages are causing like a new entry point into profession.
Innovation, right.
Innovation, which is called apprenticeship. You said something before that is shocking to me. You said that right now, as when we're recording this in 2026, that law school applications are up 25%. I'm curious around that. Do you think that part of the reason is that some of these young folks don't want to enter the workforce because they don't exactly know what they want to do or if there's space for them? Because in my small circles who I talk to, there's a change from when I was entering, the workforce in my early 20s. And, a lot of these younger people don't have jobs available to them and their careers are definitely more unstable than they were. And so, going to law school for 3 years kind of puts it off. Do you think there's a phenomenon around that a little bit?
Yes, I think that is part of the phenomenon. And the other big factor that is attributed for law school in particular is what's being called the Trump bump, which is that young people who see that, in their minds, right, the only part of government system that is working is the legal checks and balances happening in the courts. And they are moved and motivated by this idea that what they're calling a social justice incentive to jump in and help in this way, because the law has been like a, sort of point of last defense to save democracy. That this is how the theory goes.
That's contributing to the increase in people going to law school?
If you read about it, that's what people say. And my daughter, I have one who went to college and one who didn't. The one who did go to college and found school extremely difficult, has a degree that she's never used. She said to me, out of the blue, when all the stuff was going on at 25, I've looked into going to law school, Mom, and I never thought she would go to school again. She, struggled through school. And I think I should go to law school, but I looked it up and it was too expensive, but I really would like to go, So, I feel like there's some validity to that theory.
Yeah, interesting. Well, obviously, we're all keeping an eye on this. In terms of writing the book and looking out into the future, let's talk about skills, right? More importantly than the structure, perhaps, is what are the most important skills from your viewpoint that younger people need to be developing in this world to maybe have the best shot at being successful and having an abundant career? Like, what did you find in your research that were those qualities or skills that were most important?
Well, I taught a course this past semester called How to Get Hired in the Age of AI, and this was for undergraduates. But what I see in the literature and in the work we're doing, my nonprofit is doing with community colleges, which serve all ages. Community college are serving, students up through their 50s. I'm seeing similar trends. So I think what I'm about to say applies at any age, which is we're seeing the need to lean into AI, even though like young people at least don't want to, and be able to demonstrate that you can get things done and create efficiencies, even, new ideas and new projects that you can use AI in workflows, et cetera. There's also a premium, as you've probably heard, right, on human skills, right? In the field is called durable skills, which are, can you demonstrate that you can manage teams, that you can collaborate, that you have critical thinking capabilities, that you're curious, and that you can communicate. These will be at a premium in a workplace where there's fewer people managing a lot of bots. That's how the theory goes. Because we interviewed a lot of employers and asked the question, okay, what AI skills do you expect an early career person to have, or a mid-career for that matter, when you're hiring? How would you want it communicated by the applicant? And the skills for AI were, basically using it for creativity, using it for polish, using it for workflow, obviously research. Those were kind of the big categories. On the how would you want it displayed, it was, show me a time, have a section in your written resume where you're describing the skills, and then have if you're in an interview, be able to talk about situations where you have taken the initiative, right, to display these kinds of skills. And that's on the AI side. And on the human skills side, it's hard. I mean, I'm looking to do some more research into how do we credential human skills. The lab that I did run, and now I'm board chair, 12 years, we have done a lot of research on human skills, and we actually created credentials that learners could earn around critical thinking, communications, collaboration. They were popular, but we have had trouble, I will confess, getting employers to use them as signals in their hiring, partly because it's hard to differentiate one credential from another. So we've been really pushing like associations, whether the Manufacturing Institute or the Society for Higher Human Resource Managers, they probably should be the ones creating these credentials for human skills that colleges or anyone, right, workers could, get a black belt, kind of like Six Sigma. Can you show that you have a black belt in critical thinking or in communications? I think we're going to get to that point in hiring because you're going to need to be able to understand someone's level of competency in their human skills. Right now, you just say, oh, I was captain of the basketball team, and that's not a bad marker. I was an Eagle Scout. But what have you done to demonstrate very specific critical thinking skills, for example, is the next frontier.
And I think that's a lot of what I'm covering on this podcast. A lot of
Really?
we're talking a lot about the soft skills. You mentioned some keywords there. You call them durable skills. Some people call them soft skills. You mentioned curiosity, right? I mean, huge. I've had so many guests on that are huge, like big, successful people. And they're like, the qualities are curiosity. The qualities are empathy even. This is what people are talking about in terms of like, what are humans going to do work-wise? What are the markers for future success? And so I love the idea of like having these be credentials, right? Like putting them into a structure. But I want to just also pull back and just pose like a different kind of question around this whole thing, because, a lot of this is kind of the way that education works and the way that, companies and the way that we're set up, to work in the world, comes from the whole Industrial Revolution lineage, right? Which feels like the whole core of it feels like it's, being questioned or challenged, or it's up right now, right? Like we're all looking at what is the future of work? Like what is going to happen here? And I've had a lot of guests on here, AI people that are like, look, we're going to see some radical changes that society is not ready for. I had somebody on here that said like, look, this is going to break society, and this is not somebody that's a dummy. Okay. This is somebody that has some level of understanding and competency. Now I'm not in that level yet, but, I also had another guest who's doing something very interesting, has a business called College Works, where he basically, instead of going to college, these kids are basically getting a franchise to like learn how to grow a local painting houses chapter And he's training them to be entrepreneurs, basically. He's training them how to sell. He's training them how to manage people. He's training them how to hire. And I like that. And I have an 8-year-old daughter, and I'm thinking about entrepreneurial skills as something that is becoming very important to be self-sustaining and not just looking to, get into the right college and get the right degree and fit into a company. And again, I don't think that's going away, but is entrepreneurial skills something that, is being taken more seriously? Did you see any of that in your research? Is there any validity to this little inkling that I have around it?
Well, absolutely. The way that most of the skills that I've mentioned and you've mentioned express in a work format, if you will, is through entrepreneurship, right? I mean, initiative, collaboration, critical thinking, a lot of that best expresses in showing entrepreneurship ability. And so I think that there are two trend lines that kind of conflict with each other. One is that young people, and, I'd say a lot of us these days, we don't want to work for the man because, the corporate America is seen as straying from the, the moral compass, if you will, that many particularly young people feel. And yet they're not that interested in going out and starting their own business because, well, that's a lot of work. I started my nonprofit in 2012 and, my kids saw me sort of working around the clock to get it going for a couple of years. And I see them as not wanting to follow in my footsteps, right? Because they're like, you had to work too hard, Mom. And I see that with a lot of their friends as well, these two opposing views. And so what I see, my one daughter lives in Portland, Oregon, where so many of the young people are in the gig economy, but they're only in the gig economy to kind of get by. They're not trying to create the wealth that, in my generation, we went to work in corporate America to create. And so I don't know where that leads us. Maybe that's setting them up to be okay with your other guests' concern about breaking society, needing less, right? But I do worry about that as well. But to answer your question, entrepreneurial skills, absolutely. I was just on a call earlier today talking about how do we fund the development of those kind of programs like your College Works program. We need more of at the community colleges, at four-year universities. Let's not just help you figure out how to do the data analytics to be on the line in a corporate America job, but what about starting your own or taking over a small business? Because, 60% of people work in small businesses, right?
Yeah, I think, we're touching on something that's really interesting, which is around work ethic, something that our generation and most of my listeners understand. Yeah, you want to be successful, you got to work hard. There's a compromise in life. And it feels like that is changing for younger generations who don't necessarily want to work hard, which, to be honest, isn't such a bad thing. I don't know. There's always been a part of it to me that, life has got to be hard. This narrative has always just not resonated with me. And it has been hard at times for me as well, right? So I get it. But there's also on the other side of that, this potential, just laying down, and being a little bit lazy, and not going for it and not being proactive and wanting to make the most. And I just don't know where that leaves us, right? I mean, it's one of those things that I think we're all struggling with, and we're just going to have to let it play out. And I think as parents...
Can I just jump in to say, lazy is not a word that I would use because, they carry you on a lot of the angst that we've given them. In fact, I've thought about writing about this topic, which is we have kind of set them up to worry a lot. I don't feel like it's laziness. I feel like it's almost a different wiring about priorities, but I don't see laziness in that generation as much as it is. Some of it's a little bit of fear of failure for sure. In fact, that's one of the things that we've been talking about teaching, and certainly the Stanford Design School, and I teach design thinking right now. We try to label some of the workshops like getting over fear of failure, fail forward, and those kinds of, and they love that stuff. It's very helpful for them, I think.
I think it's fair. I mean, I think the word lazy has a terrible connotation, and I'm not trying to say that the whole generation is lazy. I mean, there is that narrative out there. I don't believe it at all.
Right.
Everyone has to take responsibility for their own. It's just the whole thing is really interesting. And I do want to talk about your reinvention, right? Because you did reinvent yourself. Because, my listeners are all people in their 40s, maybe even in their 50s, who have work up in the air. I mean, this conversation has been very focused on the next generation and how can we prepare them, which I think is important. But you are somebody that has reinvented. And I want to hear a little bit about that. But actually, before I ask you about that, one last final question. if you're talking to my listeners who have kids that are, anywhere from 15 up to 25, let's say, what one piece of advice would you give them in terms of how can they guide their kids the best right now? If you have to distill it down from your book and your research and all your teaching, I mean, you're in this, like, what's the one thing that you would say that could help them?
Well, I feel like the mental health is what I'm most worried about with this generation. And so I think that one piece of advice that I would have is you don't need to stress too much about it, because we are in the eye of the cyclone right now with respect to all the prognostications about what's going to happen with AI. I mean, some of it appears to be coming true, but some of it appears to be the brakes are on, right? Because companies are, for instance, learning that it's too expensive to replace humans with large language models. And so, I don't think it will go as fast as we thought it might. On the other hand, big changes are coming, but humans adapt, and it's being on the cusp of things that is both opportunity and creates a lot of angst and fear. I'm actually older than you and maybe most of your listeners. So part of my reinvention was I was at America Online, little startup in the mid 90s when, the internet revolution happened. There was so much hand wringing about all the jobs that were going to go away, and so much, also kind of excitement about what the internet could do for us. And, those of us who just were lucky enough to be there on the front lines. I mean, I was an early product developer at AOL. By leaning in, and this is where part of my advice is, to lean in, because by leaning in, we were able to be experts, and that kind of could carry you through. You were an expert with 6 months of experience, right? And so if you get in early to either teach yourself, which you can now, or, get a job where you're invited to figure out how to utilize large language models or AI strategies, you can, position yourself and build the confidence to really catapult yourself into, any field you want. That happened so much with the people around me at AOL in the mid 90s. It was an exciting time, and it was a scary time. Some jobs did go away, but, one of the jobs we invented was UX, that got invented at places like America Online in 1996. I remember being on the first UX team. It was exciting.
And by the way, not to age myself too, I mean, I worked at DoubleClick, which is a big internet company.
DoubleClick was one of the companies that came out of that boom, right?
Yeah, I was there in 1996, to 2000. And it's a little aside for my listeners here. You want to know about me a little bit, right? So when I graduated college, I didn't know what I wanted to do. And I actually moved out to San Francisco by myself. I didn't know anyone in San Francisco. I moved out and I bartended for a year. And this was 1995. And one of the people that came into my bar, another young guy, and he was, I'd be serving a beer. He's like, what are you doing just serving beer? I'm like, I don't know. He's like, well, I'm going to get you an interview at my company. Like I work for America Online, right?
Oh, really?
And I kind of heard of it. I didn't really know what it was. This is 1995. And so I went on the interview. Maybe you interviewed me. Who knows? Way back when. Maybe we're coming full circle. But I went in the interview, and the guy's like, so do you know what America Online is? I'm like, well, not really, kind of. And he's like, so come over to my computer. And he sits me down, and you hear that. Remember the sound?
Yeah, the dial-up.
He's like, that's us. We're getting people onto a platform called America Online, which is the internet, right? And I was like, okay. And I didn't end up taking, I got a job offer to be like, whatever, an assistant. Yeah, but I didn't take it, right? And probably.
You didn't take it, okay. Well, you could have got a lot of stock options.
Can you imagine? Like 3 years later, I moved back to New York, and they were building the AOL Time Warner Center, literally off of Central Park. And I was like, oh my God, like I would have been so early in this company. One of my big, it's not a failure. It's just, I was young and I didn't know, and it's led me on my path. I've had a lot of experiences like that. I also had an opportunity to work for Google early when I left DoubleClick, and I said no to that. I didn't want to sell search anymore, is what I had told my parents and my friends. So I've been around like where you have, and I appreciate your perspective. I think it's a really juicy conversation, but I do want to talk about your reinvention, because you did in your 50s decide to make a change. And you mentioned before that all of a sudden you started a nonprofit and you worked really hard, that kind of maybe turned your kids off to working that hard. But talk to me about, what you did and why you did it, to reinvent yourself, when it sounds like you had a really successful career in a lot of ways. Like, what prompted you to think about a change mid-career? And talk to me about the journey that you went on.
Yeah, well, I'd always had these high profile jobs. I mean, I had been a TV journalist in my early career and had, was like ABC White House correspondent. And then I was I mean, I had a background in my studies of defense, and I covered defense. So I got hired by Bill Clinton's team to be the spokesman at the Pentagon, the first female to do it. So I had all these high profile jobs. But then as my career went on, I kind of defined myself as somebody who always worked for someone else in a high pressure situation and helped them realize their dream. It never really hit me that like building the visions of others when I was quite an ideator myself or an ideas person. And so it was when my father died and he had been this late bloomer entrepreneur who, and I hadn't realized until I was preparing his eulogy, this was in like 2012, he had founded a company at 53, which it went public. I mean, it took off, and it was an accounting software. It was early software days, and, took on Oracle and SAP and all these other companies. And he was wildly successful, still is to this day. And, I wasn't involved in the company, so I didn't really realize he was 53. I'm 53. I was sort of like, okay. I took over the family foundation at that point. So I had some funding that I could deploy only in a nonprofit way with a foundation. And I thought, well, my passion at this point is really to help figure out how do you use education to break the cycle of poverty. I was on the board at the time of a university. So, I had worked at Sallie Mae. So I was in the field at this point of education, but I wasn't in charge myself of a vision, and it wasn't my vision. And so I thought I should launch this, with some of these funds. And so I didn't take a salary because it was through our foundation that we did the initial funding, but then it took off. And, I always tell that story that if you think when you're 53 that, maybe I've got one good job left, at the rodeo, it could be because you've got so many different kinds of experience. It can be your best rodeo run, right? If you just kind of believe in yourself. Because at that point, I'd pigeonholed myself, having an interesting job, managing somebody else, basically.
Right.
And that actually got really old.
Let me ask you, I want to ask one more question on this, right? Because this is really interesting. And I think there's a lot of people out there, my listeners and others, who are in their 40s or 50s. And by the way, I'm 53 right now. So you're like just exactly speaking.
Okay.
Yeah, no, I'm literally 53 years old. And so it's very inspiring to hear this. And, you have a trajectory, right? And it feels hard to make that kind of change. And it's interesting that it was your father's death, and I'm sorry for his passing, and writing his eulogy, right, where it kind of woke you up, right? And so I have a practice in my work and my coaching that I do where I have people write their own eulogy.
Wow.
To wake themselves up, and I give them permission to think really big about their future, and it actually wakes them up. I'm like, oh my God, wait, what am I doing? Like, it gets them out of the doldrums a little bit. And I think you had a little bit of that when
Absolutely.
you read your dad's journey, and then it kind of motivated you to now make a change. How did you muster the energy? How did you muster the motivation, as a 53-year-old to go ahead and make a big change? I think that's what a lot of my listeners encounter. It's like, oh, good idea, but like, how am I going to do that? Like, I'm not 20 anymore. Like, I can't just like go out and set the world on fire, or at least I don't feel that way. Did you encounter that limitation at all, or were you just so motivated? Talk to me about that part of the process, because I think it's really relevant.
I mean, I think a little bit, but, I'd felt like a caged animal to an extent, with some of these people who, I mean, I haven't told you about all the roles I've had, but some of them were, with either very well-known people or people who were really hard to manage. And I was burnt out on that, but I wasn't burnt out on work or creating value for like a societal good. And that was something I had never been able to do really. So I was excited about it. And unlike you, I didn't have an 8-year-old. That same year, I became an empty nester. It was like the kids were leaving, my parents had both passed, and, I had a husband still around, but, and a dog. So I felt like, what am I going to do? I was almost a little bit the opposite. I didn't feel tired yet. I felt energized.
Right. Okay. That's good to know. All right, good. I love the conversation. I could keep going with you, but I think we've covered a lot of really important topics, right? Just how to think about the future for our children and the next generations and what to prepare them for. I think you've brought up a couple of really important points. And we didn't even get into the trades, like the trade schools. I mean, that may be another conversation, because that is a lens, that feels like, oh my God, I'm now going to be a blue collar worker, and I have a lot of conversations on here around like what are the future jobs. And, believe it or not, what you said, and you alluded to it earlier, is that those types of jobs are up and coming,
Yeah.
and really do have promising future, and kind of goes against the grain of what a lot of white collar folks think of creating value or success, but there's some there. But so there's another pin there. And then also your reinvention and what you're doing. You want to say something on that though? I saw it in your face.
Well, I just wanted to say that I think that the lines between blue collar and white collar are merging because of the technicality, the extreme technicality of some of the what used to be called blue collar jobs now require, just as much math as your financial services desk job, for example. I mean, that's what we're seeing. Yeah, I've talked to educators about this, that the math preparation for, being on the line in a semiconductor robotics repair role is more than what you're going to need in the age of AI to be a quant, on Wall Street. You can't really judge by the schooling anymore, which is kind of good. And I think high schools are really waking up to having an increasing role in what was called CTE, career and technical education, where you need to learn sort of the beginnings of trades or like applied math, right? Even in high school, and everyone, like in places like New York City, everyone's beginning to learn to apprentice and to learn some of the trade opportunities. So I think you'll see a lot of changes in redesigning high school as well.
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, the apprenticeship word is also really interesting that you brought in. I'm gonna track that a little bit too. So I just want to thank you, for being here and sharing your wisdom and your story and the work that you're doing. You obviously are very passionate about this and very reinvention aligned, helping think about the future of work and making it easier for people to figure out their place in the world, which is our goal here. And I'll, of course, link to your book and your work in the byline below. And I just want to thank you for being here and engaging in the conversation.
Well, thank you, Todd.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure.
A lot of fun.